Welcome, and thanks for joining our heavily themed October webinar today. We have a spooktacular discussion about Veeam implementations. We are going to cover ways to avoid the graveyard, aka common mistakes to avoid. We'll pull the sheet off the ghost of scary implementations and where to get your garlic necklace of troubleshooting help. I've got bad jokes all day, but I'm going to leave most of the rest of them up to the presenters. So briefly, I am Trista Perot, Director of Marketing for GlobalDataVault, a data prize company, and I have a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. The webinar is going to run close to the witching hour, but we'll be sure to leave time for questions before the werewolf changes back to a man. While everyone is set to listen only mode, we absolutely want to hear your questions. I'll be monitoring chat as well as a couple of my colleagues, and we'll capture any thoughts you'd like to address either immediately or at the end. The webinar is being recorded in case you are a ghost hunter and you want to watch it again, or you need to leave early. We'll get you that link after the session, and it'll be on our website, or you can watch it via YouTube or our website anytime. So before things get too batty, let me stir the cauldron with what's brewing. Much like Frankenstein was a beautiful monster made of different functioning parts, GlobalDataVault is now a division of DataPrize, which is a managed IT service provider for mid-market businesses. We provide leading IT solutions to organizations across the United States, not Transylvania. To carry the theme, DataPrize offers bleeding edge IT solutions and services that enable our clients to excel at their core business. Our service suite includes managed cybersecurity, managed user, 24/7 help desk, managed infrastructure, and more. We want to add extreme value to our clients by becoming their end-to-end technology partner. And one of the ways we excel at this is through our BCDR division, which some of the folks in our audience may already know us as GlobalDataVault. While we're part of a much bigger DataPrize family now, we continue our commitment to being the premier Veeam Platinum Cloud service provider, offering fully managed disaster recovery as a service, backup as a service, and Microsoft 365 backup solutions. We pride ourselves at being specialists when it comes to Veeam, and we demonstrate that through our deep expertise and talented staff, which includes Veeam architects and a Veeam Vanguard. And with that, let me start introducing our speakers. Special guest is a fan favorite, Tim Hudson, Senior Solutions Architect for Veeam Software and our IT guy. Get it? A little double meaning there. He's joined by Stephen New, Operations Director for GlobalDataVault, Veeam Vanguard, and our favorite mummy, and Kelly Caldwell, Senior Service Transition Manager for DataPrize, who can cast a spell for success on any Veeam environment. So let me turn this over to our legendary lobster as he wants to kick us off with a few remarks.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. So glad to be here. My name is Tim Hudson. As a Senior Solution Architect, I help our partners like GDV and DataPrize build, manage, and deliver Veeam services. And we wanted to talk about common implementation challenges today. We're going to start with some licensing discussion. And just one more time, I'm really happy to be here. So Kelly, our first topic is around licensing. I know you were so thrilled that we were going to start our chat with this. Question for you, thinking about licensing challenges. Have you ever ran into a situation where you've been attempting to help a end customer and you had to run through some, maybe basic or high level discussion around license versions and license capabilities?
I have, but the better question is butter or lemon or both. Licensing isn't easy, right? Customers have specific needs. They need feature sets. They need to solve problems. And obviously the product can do that. But the biggest challenge that I see is customers may not have the appropriate license, or they have to worry about, the counts of systems and things like that. And it gets confusing. I mean, just here on this slide, we have 4 or 5 different types of licensing, and each one has some different versions and additions and things like that. And you can throw in limitations with some essentials and the NAS licensing and whatnot. So yeah, we get it all the time where the customers are worried about their licensing or they're up for renewal, and it becomes just another management headache for them. So that's a lot of the times, where I experience these things. Now, a lot of it is between, some of the Enterprise and Enterprise Plus editions. So what are the things that you can tell us about those? Specifically, the availability suite is Veeam Backup and Replication, and Veeam One, which is a monitoring and reporting and management feature set. What are the biggest things that you see with, enterprise plus concerns?
Yes. Use of scale out repositories is probably the single thing that I've seen most as, I don't want to say a gotcha, but maybe certain customers didn't plan what their implementation was going to be like. And they run into a scenario where they need to leverage a scale out repository. And maybe they didn't realize there's a limit upon the number of extents, with one particular version. Or maybe they needed a feature like WAN acceleration, to try to deliver data maybe offsite to a service provider. And these are things that I've ran into, and sometimes customers have to make a change. Steven, I was curious, for GDV and Dataprise, is there a particular license type that you standardize on for your existing, managed service end customers?
Yeah, by default, Tim, we go with a standard license unless the customer needs additional features. So what we normally see is our biggest request is normally, like you mentioned, the scale out backup repositories. That's our number one request. Some customers do use scale out. We also have a big request for NAS backups so they can back up their file shares. That being new in the latest, or excuse me, the release before last, D10, that we really need to get the customer that license so they can back up their critical NAS data.
Totally makes sense. I mean, seems like a maybe small thing depending on who our audience is, but this is a big deal. Now, I was also curious for you as a managed service provider, how hard is it to change a managed customer's license? Like, let's say, for example, you engaged with a customer, you deliver some licensing, maybe as part of your managed services, and something changes in the future. This happens to all sorts of folks. So what's your process like, or how difficult is that?
So us being certified service provider, all that we really have to do is just log into the portal and just click a few buttons. The license gets updated from standard to enterprise or enterprise plus. And then once we update the license, all that we have to do is just go into the customer's Veeam console, click update now, and they have the new license.
Okay, so pretty quick adjustment there. I mean, incredible. I think that's quite different from a traditional Veeam user that might be more challenging. Awesome.
Yeah, I think one of the larger things too, just real quick on that Essentials is, the Essentials pack is licensed similar to VMware, right? Where it's limited to a certain number of hosts, certain number of machines, certain type of infrastructure. And a lot of customers today will outgrow that. And it can be painful or costly to upgrade out of that. And when you're using a managed service provider license like ours, again, we just install our license. We give you the capability to use our feature set without having to worry about those Essentials limitations. So you can just continue to grow and scale. All right. So one of the big things in our corny configurations that we see are not verifying backups. Common scenario here, and whether it's, we're going to talk about backup modes and full backup and things like that here. So the trick is not verifying your backups. Steven, what's the issues that we see with the different backup modes, et cetera?
Really no issues regarding the actual backup modes themselves. I mean, not verifying your backup is critical because you don't want to get into a real DR event and notice that something is not functioning like you want. So we do request that you do verify your backups. You can do something as simple as a file level restore to your desktop to verify the chain is good. If you want to get a little more granular, you can actually go in and do an instant recovery. Just rename the server something different. Don't connect the NICs to verify the chain functions properly.
Yeah, and that's really good. Restoring a file is one thing, but being able to recover an entire virtual machine is something completely different. And that's a lot of times where people will lose data or they'll have big issues as they come across a disaster scenario and they haven't tested that. And they're like, well, we've been able to recover files. And then they go to power on that virtual machine and they didn't realize one of the OS files was corrupt, or, something in the chain was broken and they're just unable to recover their data. So our treat for this is the annual disaster recovery test, right? Power everything up, make sure everything works, give it a test, you're good to go.
Quick question on there, because I'm thinking, Veeam has some abilities like you guys have described for some, administrative type of actions to go and test some backups, right? But like you talked about, a file or a disk or one machine. But when I think about large groups of machines, I recognize that could be a challenge for certain customers to test. It also makes me think about connectivity. If users are testing in their own infrastructure, they're not really planning for that site failure because you need to think about connectivity somewhere else. Could you guys give me an example of how you solve some of those larger tests? where you include some connectivity test. I'm asking the question from an angle of what above and beyond just the Veeam process you can share with the potential customers on the webinar today.
Yeah, so by default during our annual test, Tim, we do send the virtual machines up into an instant recovery state. And we do provide our standard service does allow for a virtual VPN and also a virtual router that does the networking for the customer. So what we do during the initial test, the DR test, is we send the customer a spreadsheet where they put in their networking information. And then once we import that into our build system with the click of a button and all the magic behind the scenes, it automatically builds the customer's networking, puts them in their own VLAN for testing so the machines are segmented from all of our other customers. That is their VLAN. And then it automatically spits out a VPN account for them, and they can connect up to 10 users for a test. And then they can go in, perform any testing that they do in their environment. We request that they do it on the DR side. What I like to call it whenever I talk to customers is kick the tires. So we want them to go in and kick the tires. We want to make sure that your SQL applications work. We want to make sure that you can connect to your web portals. We want to make sure all this stuff functions prior to you having an actual event and having to work through any issues in that event. We request that any customer perform these tests during their annual DR test to verify functionality.
I think that's a really great answer, because to me, that's how you make this a comprehensive solution, leveraging some Veeam tools, but really doing something that our end customers should. And considering you have that offsite platform, it's a really great package. Awesome.
The other configuration challenge is customers not getting backups offsite or having a secondary backup. Obviously, that's why we exist. That's why Veeam provides this service, is simply for customers to do that and protect data offsite. And that's where the 3-2-1 rule comes into play. We've done a lot of different blog posts and webinars and other things about the 3-2-1 rule. You can read about them on GlobalDataVault.com. But it's basically 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, 1 offsite. So we have to allow for that 1 offsite to prevent or to protect against overall site failures. So damage to the facility, fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, things like that. The overall architecture of the solution will protect against different failures within the infrastructure, but that 1 offsite is really the only way to protect against everything, potentially and including malware and ransomware and things like that. Tim, from the 3-2-1 rule, we know how important it is. How many people out there today still don't quite have all their claws when it comes to the 3-2-1 rule?
I was actually going to ask you the same thing, but I'll give you my answer. It's far too many. Veeam works very hard to produce a comprehensive set of options in our software. Whoever you want to send it to, wherever you want to send it to, we'd like to give our customers choice. We think we do a good job of that, whether it's in their own infrastructure, a service provider's infrastructure, or even a hyperscaler's infrastructure. We think we give a comprehensive set of options. But I know, having worked with service providers for the last 6 years of my Veeam career, working at a service provider for the 10 years before that, still a lot of folks not doing this. We're not doing this the right way. Maybe it's not holistic. Maybe they're just sending a part. But if they're not doing a comprehensive annual DR test, they might not even know that that part is not sufficient. So I wanted to know from your side, maybe give me an example, Stephen, of a DR test where somebody realized they were missing some critical infrastructure. Or Kelly, I'm just curious if customers come to you and you find out, even though it's 2022, even though there's all these options in the console, that people still aren't doing it. Do you guys see that? I do across the globe.
Yeah, we do for sure. The most common thing too is just the sort of misconception that everything is okay the way it is, or that they take their backups offsite in the back seat of their car, or, some of those other types of things. We have had some challenges with infrastructure and whatnot, like you mentioned, that Stephen can talk about. Stephen, what do you think about the missing the 1, or even let's take it a step further and talk about the 1 extra that we do and have another layer of protection in there to provide even a better gap against malware and that type of thing?
Well, I'm going to address 2 of y'all's questions. The first one, Tim, you asked in a DR event, customers realizing that they missed critical infrastructure components. Yes, we have seen that. Thankfully, it was actually during a DR test, and they realized, hey, wait a minute, I don't have my Citrix environment in the cloud. And that was a big miss right there. So we worked with the customer. They created the backup jobs, got their Citrix environment up to us during the test, and we were able to immediately get it online during that test without having to reschedule. And then Kelly, your question about realizing that customers do get hit by ransomware. So we do have a technology that we have in the back end called enhanced data protection, which we call it internally EDP. It keeps a offline copy that the customer cannot access. So these malware and ransomware events, normally what they do is they remove the data from your repository. If they can't see the data, they can't remove the data. So whenever we do perform tests, we perform tests from that EDP data. It actually verifies functionality of the data. And then the customer also gets their DR test as well. So it's a win-win situation. And that EDP data has saved more than 100 companies that we've supported that would be out of business if that data did not exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks volumes. Veeam's adjusted our 3-2-1 rule a little bit, or at least we've proposed additional thinking. We've started to talk about a broader zip code that includes these types of things like protected backups or offline backups as being really part of that. I think it speaks volumes that you have integrated this into your solution and your customers can consume it. This touches on our next little trick here that I certainly see regularly today. Not enough time and effort spent on planning a Veeam data protection implementation. And that lack of planning either leads to failed or challenging DR tests or sizing issues that cause some teeth gnashing, thinking about repositories on a source end or repositories on a target end. I see our treat here, but I was hoping you guys could maybe speak to how you help folks with some of these planning or sizing challenges.
Sizing is actually critical, Tim. If we don't know the proper sizing of the source data, it's going to be hard for us to plan or size the Veeam server that we put on the customer site. I mean, if customer comes in with 6 terabytes worth of data and we find out it's really 12 terabytes worth of data, the server that we put on site could be under provision for that data size. Cloud side, I'm not really worried about because we can adapt really easy to that. But mainly the local sizing is what we see issues with. And we actually do have a tool called Veeam One. For customers not familiar with that, it's actually a size your device properly to make sure that you have sufficient amount of resources and space based on the change rate. So we can do a configuration assessment of your VMware or Hyper-V environment. And then we can also run a report that will give us the change rate configuration of your virtual machines. What machines have the highest change rate? What machines have the lowest change rate? And then we can use that to size your LDVs or local data vaults, which is your Veeam server that you have on site, to make sure that you have enough space locally to get those 2 copies of data and then get the one offsite as well.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that we have from a disaster recovery standpoint, because we do bring customers virtual machines and servers and whatnot up in our cloud, the time-old adage of it's virtual, just throw resources at it. Look, I can give this virtual machine 64 vCPUs and 128 gigs of RAM. Yes, and it's just like, no, don't do that. And Veeam One is pretty good about going in and saying, here's what this virtual machine is provisioned at today. Here's what it's really using and here's what it needs. And maybe you want to think about scaling that back a little bit. When you try to bring up a bunch of servers in another environment, things don't always mesh up and you end up having more performance issues. And a lot of times it can just simply be because the machines are over provisioned. They have too many resources because you still are within the constraints of the actual physical devices that host those and, other resources needing CPU time and memory time and things like that. So Veeam One also will look at your configuration for overutilized, underutilized, virtual machines and things. So it's another good way to use the tool. Let's see. So we've talked about configurations, and now let's look at some monster misinformation. I don't know about you, Stephen, but that thing looks a little bit like Tim does right now.
Yeah, it does, actually.
So having worked with Veeam for a long time, and Veeam did a lot of things before other people in the backup and disaster recovery space did. They were pioneers with a lot of different technology. And a lot of times when you have that happen, you see FUD, right? Which is fear, uncertainty, or doubt. It's basically misinformation that's spread by competitors or by people in the industry about no, that doesn't work, or you don't need that, or, why would anybody ever need to restore a backup as a VM, or, whatever. Why would anyone want to power on a backup? And now it's second nature to everything that we do in the disaster recovery space. So let's talk about a few of these things. I think we've already talked about multiple copies of your backups. What do you guys think? I mean, do we need to hammer that one?
Yeah, let me sink my claws into it for a second, just
Okay.
a little bit more, because sometimes people think this is multiple copies, needing what you have on the source side or your production site with an equal copy offsite. We appreciate that. We have that functionality built into our scale out repositories. We have this backup copy capability to send data to our service providers, and it can be the same copy as the data on site, could be a different backup chain. And what I'd ask people to think about is sometimes locally, we might want to just have a small amount of data. To Stephen's point earlier, thinking about your local data vault or LDV, your local repository, you might size that a certain way, only to keep 30 days worth of backups. Well, if you have historical requirements, let's make sure that data is offsite long term, monthly backups, yearly backups, or a long set of weekly backups. A lot of folks don't realize that they can have that data on site today with local GFS policies. You could have an equivalent copy off-site with traditional backup copy jobs. And I think it's just really important to work with your internal organization or a partner like GDV to understand what's possible or why, because it bothers me, to be honest, to hear things like, it's expensive to store that data offsite that our company makes us store. We have this good corporate policy to keep X amount of data. It's reality that we need to keep these additional backup chains for historical purposes. Veeam makes them separate backup chains. It's important. And so the idea that we don't need multiple copies or that we don't need multiple chains, it's wild. I think it's an opportunity to work with a partner almost to consult and understand what do we need and why do we have this policy to keep this data? And then finally, where should we send it? Safe and secure place, hopefully like a GDV. It's also a place where we can do a test on that data local to the data itself.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned, the data is already secure, or why do we need to send it somewhere else, right? Because the hyperscalers, the Azures, the cloud, the public cloud type infrastructures, the misconception there is that they're already protecting my data. It's the cloud. What are you talking about? My data is secure and it's being backed up. No, it's not. And no, it's not. The only thing that a lot of these hyperscalers or the cloud companies or service providers of that type really offer is the infrastructure, the platform, the physical security, the power to the servers that are providing these services. And there's shared responsibility models and a lot of small writing and fine print that say, okay, here's what we do, but you're responsible for literally everything else, including the backups and the protection of that data, and insofar as even ransomware protection and things like that. So, Stephen, when we think about public cloud, the Azures and the AWSs and that, how are we able to help customers with that scenario?
Well, first of all, we're able to get a backup into place locally for them, and then we can move that data to the cloud, because you always want a copy of your data outside of the cloud provider, just in case there is, knock on wood, an issue or something were to happen. You have a secondary copy out of that platform to where you can access, and if something were to happen, you can bring that up in your DR environment, and then you can go back to work as normal. Veeam is amazing because after you go back to work as normal in your DR environment, we can actually inject that data back into Azure for you. We can do a restore back to Azure using an Azure proxy. So once that is done, the event's over with, you need to get your data back into the cloud. We can restore that data back for you. All the data that we protect from the cloud providers, we enable EDP as well. So if something malicious were to happen, we have a copy of your data outside your repository, just like our on-prem customers that have servers local or on-prem.
Yeah, I think one other important point of that is retention again, and the cost associated with some of that. It may be worthwhile to keep, 14 days, 30 days, whatever, of backups local to the public cloud space, but then you want to send everything after that. You want to send your 12 monthlies or your yearlies or, the other data outside of that to a different provider to not only provide the 321 rule and the additional protection, but to maintain control of your data, which ultimately is a goal of most organizations. Is you want to maintain control, you want to understand where the data is, how you access it, who do you call if you need to access it, because typically, unless you are sure it's written in your contract, the cloud providers, they're typically only going to maintain that data for a certain amount of time. And you might not know where that is. You may not know where that data is located. It could be shipped somewhere across the world in a backup state. And unless it's contractually specified not to do that, you could have issues if for compliance reason you have to have your data in a certain part of the country, things like that. So a lot of different scenarios there to consider. The important part is, it's not a be all just because it's a public cloud. So don't get lulled into that FUD.
Well, this makes me think about our next bullet point. I'm so confident and I'm so sure that my backups themselves are protected, not my data itself. Well, Veeam's pretty straightforward. Build the job, green, yellow, red. Your data's been protected. Is your backup data protected, though? I mean, obviously, this is a massive part of the conversation in the industry today. Do I have immutable backups, or are they secure? Meaning, for those who have access or capability to access that data, are they the appropriate folks at the appropriate times? I'd sometimes think about a hyperscaler or public object storage anywhere. Anybody's object storage. We know this stuff is accessed typically by something like an access key and a secret key. Who has access to that information? It's not a traditional username and password. Are those keys recycled? How do you audit access to that data? I wonder if end users, traditional end customers, are prepared. Are they armed with the right information, to understand what kinds of checks and balances should they have for where their data is stored? Locally, we'll traditionally think about things like network access. Can you hit this file share? Can you log into that Windows machine or Linux machine? But when we think about offsite and publicly, it's a different ballgame. It's a different beast or monster, something like that. This reminds me, Stephen, of the conversation you were just having around your EDP technology. This is an offline storage, meaning our customers cannot access this data. I mean, I think there's real value in that. It's a way for you to provide your customers backup security that they may not understand or may not implement, may not have the technical skills to implement or the time and effort.
Yeah, so I also want to mention, Tim, that part of our best practices when we do configure the backup job is we do enable encryption locally and remotely. That is another way that we at Dataprise keeps our customers' data secure is we encrypt it locally and then also encrypt it going to the cloud as well. If the customers would like, they can provide us with the encryption key. If they don't want to, they can keep it in their favorite password vault, and we will actually request it in the case of an emergency. But we always keep our customers' backup secure by encrypting the data locally and also the data that comes to the cloud. Also keep in mind that if it does go from the customer's network to our cloud network, that data is automatically encrypted in flight as well. So we encrypt in flight and at rest.
Awesome. I'm going to jump to the security best practice, Stephen. You're just making me think about this question, and I need to ask, do you help your customers consider security best practices? I mean, I'm not thinking about just a Veeam installation or keeping logs on a different directory or different drive. I'm thinking maybe holistically. What kind of things do you talk to your customers about regarding security best practices?
So whenever we have the conversation about security best practices, what we do is we always follow the best practices. Anytime we implement a Veeam solution, we request that the customer do not use the administrative account. Do not use administrator at vSphere.local. We always create service accounts with granular permissions, only giving certain accounts access to vCenter 443, running the Veeam services on a Veeam service account. We do break it down to an account level and do send them over the Veeam best practices article regarding security, account permissions. Don't give the account too much permission. That is probably our number one rule that we like to relay to our customers. Please don't use the root account. Please don't use the vSphere administrator account. let's create service accounts. Let's get those implemented. That way you only have the permissions needed for the product to function.
Yeah, I mean, not joining the backup server to the domain. A lot of times when some of the attacks that we've seen have simply because customers have had their server on the domain and somebody grabbed those domain admin credentials. Malware did, in fact. So you're not using administrator level credentials to go browse the internet, making sure you have admin accounts separate from your everyday use accounts, using MFA and zero trust wherever you can, all of those different things. We on the devices that we ship out, we always have SIEM services and antivirus, next gen EDR, detection and response, and those types of things, so that if we do see some of those attacks, we're able to react quickly to it and get the best information we can about them.
So another question just kept popping into my head. You guys are talking about these topics, and Stephen, if you walked into a prospective customer that maybe wasn't following best practices or was using an existing provider that did things differently, I mean, change is hard. It's real hard. I know that myself. Veeam knows that. And surely you must have some experience working with folks who are coming from maybe a tough spot, trying to mature their implementations and do things the right way, or they're coming from a different provider, not even saying they were doing something wrong, but to do something different may be a challenge. Is that really true? And how do you help people not fail when they're trying to make these changes?
Change is hard, I will admit that, but sometimes we have to do it for the better. Whenever we go in and we check the customer's implementation, even if they come from another provider, we always do an implementation review on all the implementations to make sure that they're not only within Veeam's best practices, but they're within Dataprise's best practices as well. So we do walk the customer through changing, and if that requires a re-implementation locally to get the customer with best practices, our implementation team will go through that with the customer, submit what changes that we're requesting, and then work with the customer to get those changes implemented so that they're not only within Veeam's best practices, that they're following security's best practices. We always recommend that customers put a SIEM and also a good antivirus program on their systems. And also we request that they have a 24-hour SOC monitoring their systems to making sure there's no brute force attacks. Dataprise does offer security as a service, so we do provide that service for our customers. And like Kelly mentioned, all of our servers that go out are LDVs, local data vaults, that are the Veeam repositories and run Veeam. They automatically get configured with a SIEM software and an antivirus software, algorithm based, and they are automatically monitored by our SOC.
Okay, so you're combining, real security. When you say SIEM, I believe that's SIEM, security, incident, and event monitoring. So you're combining that with backup service?
Correct.
Incredible.
The backup service alone these days isn't enough. You have to have this monitoring on these servers to stop these brute force attacks.
Let's talk about, we talked about I don't need to test my backups, but we kind of already, went through that a little bit. So tune testing, there's multiple levels of testing. There's multiple levels of things you can do, and Veeam has some of those built in. So let's talk about the health checks and what secure restores are. So health checks are automatic, right? They happen every job or every so often, right, Stephen?
At the beginning and at the end of the job, there is a mini health check that is performed. We go the extra mile for the customers, and we enable the health check in the advanced settings for every single job locally, backup copies to the cloud. That way it gets a good health check at the end of the month to check for corrupted chains. And keep in mind that whenever you run these health checks, Veeam does have a feature in it that if it does detect corruption, it will try to auto heal the chain. So that's something that we enable with best practices when we configure the jobs, but it is not enabled by default. So that's something that we turn on.
I think that's a really important point. It makes me think as the Veeam guy, just to those last couple words, Stephen, it is not enabled by default. That's okay. Folks should use it. And I love to see that your best practice puts a standardization to it, because obviously we've made our decision in the product. That's okay. But for you to have made that decision in your product to follow those best practices, I think is a differentiator. And it's an important, CRC check to verify the blocks in the file are the ones we expect, and that there's no, known corruption that we can see of the actual backup file. Awesome.
Yep. Can you talk us through Secure Restore real quick? We've got a couple more slides, and I know we have some questions, and I don't want to run out of time here. So we've already talked about the yearly DR tests a little bit and file level restores as testing functions. What about Secure Restore?
I mean, I'll speak to that. Secure Restore is our Veeam feature where during a recovery process, I don't care whether it's a full machine restore, an individual disk restore, or an instant VM recovery, Veeam can kind of tie into an antivirus running on that workload, an antivirus application, and we'll run an AV scan or test at that moment of restore. We'll turn on this machine and we'll verify whether that AV detects any malicious application or behavior on that system. And we can determine or define what we want that result to be. So if the machine comes back exposed or with an issue, we could shut it down. We could delete it. We could just disconnect the network because maybe you still want to come in on the console. So it's basically an antivirus scan during the process of restore with the hope, Kelly, that it tells you this machine's fine. Let's just bring it up. Or if not, that you don't get exposed again to something that maybe could be detrimental to your environment.
Yeah, that's a really good feature. And I know that we've had some customers go in and run some of their own tools. They did their own version of this, right? Where they'll come in and load a script or something that is able to go and detect malware and things and kind of do it their own way. And still that was an important feature that they were able to get in and do that before they move that data back into their production environment. So I think we've covered a lot of good info. Now let's talk about some ghoulish gaps. Now, if we don't have some of this information, where can we go to do that right now? A lot of this stuff is free. There are some paid classes and paid certifications and things like that, right? But Stephen, talk us through, you mentioned the best practices and things like that. So what are your favorites from this list?
Well, obviously it's going to be the Veeam certifications because we need to make sure that all of our technicians, our implementation engineers, our support guys stay current with their Veeam training to make sure that we give our customers the best implementation possible. So we do have 2 VMCEs, Veeam certified engineers, 2 Veeam certified architects, and we do have a Veeam Vanguard on staff. Then also, I love the forums. You have a strange issue that you've never seen before, the forums is the best place to go. You can type in your question in there, and we have people in the forums that all the way up to senior product management to a senior vice president that goes in there and answers questions for customers. You can get a direct response from the product manager, the PM assigned for the product. And if there's an issue that needs to be escalated to the dev team, they can escalate it for you with the click of a button. So the forums is probably the second big one. The third is Veeam, the Veeam free on-demand training. Who doesn't like the word free? So you can go in, you can learn more about the products by taking the free on-demand trainings. And then best practices is basically the implementation guide. You want to make sure that you're implementing a solution correctly. You can go to vdp.com and you can go to the best practices. And what I like about that side is it's searchable. So if you have a specific question, you want to look up something specific to best practice from Veeam, you can type it in at the top and it will take you directly to the words you're searching for.
Yeah, that's good. And Jason, thanks for the shout out on the helpcenter.veeam.com. It's definitely a good site there. So, Stephen mentioned a couple of the certifications that our folks have. So one of the things that you get with DRAS service from Dataprise is access to VMCEs, VMCAs, the certified folks who are competent in the solutions that we deliver. The platinum level requirements that we have are pretty stringent. Tim, I don't know if you want to mention this or not, but it's not just a here you go. You sold 5 widgets, you get a platinum level certification. Maybe back in the day it used to be that way, but talk us through that real quick.
Yeah, I think what's important for the audience to hear is that the Veeam Service Provider Program has been around for about a decade, and it's matured. It's matured a lot. I think I want to make an analogy here to these VMCE and VMCA certifications. So these are individual certifications, like Stephen on the phone, Josh Clemens, another GDV employee. These folks have professional level individual certifications, engineers and architects. And that's awesome, but they're individuals, okay? Looking on the screen here in the bottom right, we see these boxes labeled competencies. These are like certifications for an organization. And so for the audience in the webinar or those listening later, quick Google about these will tell you that these are badged, tested, verified. Think of them as offerings or services from GlobalDataVault and DataPrize. We test service providers. We ask them challenging questions about what they're doing as service providers, and it builds up into what we think are proven partners and service providers that deliver great services, not just good. These are above and beyond. And so, Kelly, my answer is that it's a comprehensive program that is viewed at many levels, individual certifications and overall organization or services certifications. It speaks to your level of depth and maturity to have achieved these. Question from the chat. How many folks have a wealth of these certifications for things like Cloud Connect backup or offsite backup, delivering managed services for Office 365 backup or DRAS? Very few. I don't need a full hand.
Well, speaking of full hand or empty hands, we have hopefully some questions. Don't be a zombie. Ask us a question. We saw one earlier in the presentation. It was sort of a comment that goes back to Windows operating systems. And, one of the common things is virtualization will allow companies and organizations to run systems far beyond the useful life of the hardware they were originally installed on. You could P2V an old server and it's still running server 2003, and it magically works in virtualization, and Veeam will magically back it up and protect it, and we can do Cloud Connect and backup copy jobs to get that data off site. One thing that doesn't magically happen is powering that sucker back on in a new environment. There's bits and blocks and things that change when you do stuff like that. Those older operating systems just can't tolerate. So, make sure that you're thinking about that when you're planning your disaster recovery strategy and your upgrade strategies onto supported platforms, because just because it works in some areas doesn't mean it's going to work or is supported to work or anything like that in other areas. So it was kind of a question about what's supported or what do you do with those outdated operating systems? And the answer is kind of like, well, we do what we can, right? Trista, do we have any other ones?
I love what Brian said. Don't be spooked to ask questions. I love a good theme. I do have a couple of questions that were sent to me. One is, we briefly talked about the 3-2-1 rule, but I'm hearing about a 3-2-1-1-0 rule. What's the difference there?
I'll jump into that. I was kind of touching on it a little earlier, but like I talked about just a minute ago, program has matured, but so has our software, and so has the capabilities of malicious actors. So we've continued to develop mature this 3-2-1 rule in our own way. And we now will call it the zip code, meaning the backup zip code. We'd like to have 3 copies of our data on 2 different media, and one of them being offsite still. Okay. So that maintains those 3 pieces. The additional 1 and 0. Yeah. Thanks for the laugh, Jason. Yeah. The additional 1 and 0 are that we'd like to have one of those copies be immutable or air-gapped or offline, out of the hands of a malicious actor. And then finally, for the 0, we'd like to have these backups tested, and we'd like to see them have 0 errors. Okay, so this is not just about having your data, but let's use that data in a way that gives our organizations and our leadership, confidence that in the time of disaster, we're prepared.
Awesome. And I'm loving the comments right now. Next question is, I have 2 more questions kind of around licensing. The first one is, do my ESXi have to be licensed by Veeam?
Your ESXi hosts have to be licensed by VMware. So there is a free version of ESXi that is available for use for anybody, for lab environments, that type of thing. Sometimes they make their ways into a production environment and the customers are running basically an unlicensed version of VMware. There's certain things within the way that backups are done, and the Veeam version, will be licensed, but if the VMware version isn't licensed, it doesn't allow you to play, right? So the car may be running, but you don't have a key to the door, basically, is what happens when you try to back up an unlicensed version of ESXi. It doesn't work.
Gotcha. And to follow up with that, also along licensing questions, what issues can happen if the Veeam license file expires? Is there a grace period before the renewal goes through? Tim, you're smiling.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm smiling because could you imagine if we didn't have a grace period? Somebody makes a slight mistake about licensing and what? We're gonna prevent you from doing backups. I mean, Veeam is not that type of organization. Veeam is one where, of course, we have a grace period for licensing. I believe it's 90 days. It's 60 or 90 days.
60 days.
60 days. Thanks, Stephen. And that helps people get their administrative stuff right and lets their backups keep going. Maybe more importantly, it lets restores continue to happen without issue. And then finally, just on that point, I'll say, even if somebody leaves Veeam and they have a long history of backups, maybe it's stored at GDV, maybe it's stored somewhere else, you can always restore those backups. We never want to be a company that prevents an organization from restoring a backup because of something like a license. So we don't want that to be the case, whether it's through the grace period or the permanently free. This is what we call the extract utility. It's very beneficial in our minds to our customers and partners. Why hose anybody? Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, Jason's got a nice comment here. They give you 10% over your VUL licensing as well. So if you go beyond your current count, you still have time to purchase new licenses, or you can burst your VM count above while you migrate to new operating system. Very flexible.
Yeah, and I'll say it in my own words, those same things. Jason, thanks for that as well. But in my own words, if you're set for 10 machines, what does Veeam get for trying to stop anybody to go to 11? Doesn't make any sense. We'll give you that.
Good deal. All right. Any other questions? Might be an incentive if there's a good one that comes up. Either during the webinar or after, I might add. I don't see chat flooding right now, so I'm going to go ahead and call it. That's a wrap for today. We so appreciate you being there. If you have any questions about today's discussion or want to discover more about Dataprise services, please contact me at marketing@dataprise.com or send me a question there, and I'll make sure that our team can answer it. Just a reminder, you can find our previous webinars and, of course, register to be notified of any future webinars at globaldatavault.com/webinars. That's where you'll also see the recap of this one with a lightly edited transcript to follow in the next week or so. So be sure and follow any, why are words so hard? Be sure and follow Global Data Vault on all of our social channels, and we are Global Data Vault on all of them. So thank you again. We'll see you next month.
Thanks.
Bye.